Hello there, and welcome to Cosmic Slumber. Tonight we are drifting back through time, past empires, and coastlines long since redrawn, to a white stone city on the edge of Egypt where the largest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever gathered once stood. Scrolls stacked floor to ceiling. Scholars arguing gently in marble courtyards. Ships docking in the harbor and surrendering their books before they were even allowed to unload their cargo. It was a place built on a single strange, beautiful idea, that everything worth knowing could, in theory, be gathered under one roof. And then, slowly, in pieces, over centuries, it was gone. Tonight we drift through what the Library of Alexandria actually was, what it may have held, and how something so vast could disappear so quietly that historians still argue about exactly how it happened. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps other sleepy minds find their way here, too, one quiet century at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your shoulders soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your thoughts drift backward, past the noise of the present, into a warm harbor city where papyrus once outnumbered stars. Let's begin. The Library of Alexandria was not built by the Egyptians who came before it. It was founded in a city established by Alexander the Great, and later shaped into a great center of learning under the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek-speaking rulers who governed Egypt after Alexander's death. The library likely began taking shape in the early 3rd century BCE, under Ptolemy I or his son Ptolemy II, part of a much larger complex known as the Mouseion, a kind of ancient research institute dedicated to the Muses. The word museum comes directly from the institution that housed the library. The Mouseion of Alexandria was not simply a building full of scrolls. It functioned more like a state-funded research center, complete with living quarters, dining halls, and gardens for scholars who were supported financially so they could dedicate themselves entirely to study. The modern word museum descends directly from this ancient Greek name, a quiet linguistic echo of an institution built for the pursuit of knowledge itself. Scholars at the library were paid a salary simply to think. Unlike many ancient centers of learning that required scholars to teach or produce goods to earn their keep, those associated with the Mouseion were supported by royal funding, given housing, meals, and time, in exchange for research, writing, and philosophical debate. It was, in a sense, one of history's earliest known examples of a government deliberately investing in pure intellectual work for its own sake. The library's true size is one of history's most debated mysteries. Ancient sources offer wildly different estimates for how many scrolls the library once held, ranging from roughly 40,000 to as many as 700,000. Because a single work could be split across several scrolls, and because ancient counting methods were inconsistent, historians today treat every specific number with real caution, while still agreeing the collection was, for its time, staggeringly large. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were sometimes required to surrender their books. According to ancient accounts, official policy in Alexandria allowed authorities to confiscate scrolls found aboard visiting ships, have them copied by library scribes, and then return the copies to their original owners while keeping the originals for the collection. Whether strictly enforced or somewhat exaggerated by later writers, the story reflects just how aggressively the library pursued growth. The library reportedly borrowed original texts from Athens and never gave them back. One frequently repeated account describes Alexandria borrowing official copies of works by great Athenian playwrights, offering a large financial deposit as security, and then choosing to forfeit that deposit entirely rather than return the originals, sending back careful copies instead and keeping the priceless originals for its own shelves. The library's collection was organized using an early system that helps shape how libraries work even today. Scrolls were reportedly sorted by subject and author, with identifying tags called Silly Boy attached to help scholars locate specific works without having to unroll each scroll individually. This early cataloging effort represents one of history's first attempts at large-scale, structured information retrieval, centuries before anything resembling a modern library catalog existed. A scholar named Callimachus is credited with creating one of the first library catalogs in history. Working at Alexandria, Callimachus is believed to have compiled a monumental listing known as the Pinarches, organizing the library's vast holdings by subject and author, along with brief biographical notes. Though the original has been lost, ancient references to it suggest a catalog so thorough it may have run to well over 100 scrolls, just to describe what the library actually contained. Alexandria's collection likely included far more than Greek texts. Because the city sat at a crossroads of trade and culture, the library is believed to have accumulated works translated from Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and other traditions, alongside its core collection of Greek philosophy, poetry, and science. In gathering material this broadly, Alexandria functioned less like a single nation's archive and more like an ancient attempt at a truly international collection of thought. The Hebrew Bible was reportedly translated into Greek at Alexandria. According to tradition, A project undertaken in Alexandria resulted in the translation of Jewish scripture into Greek, a work later known as the Septuagint. Whether the specific legendary details of the project are accurate or embellished, the translation itself became historically significant, shaping how Jewish and later Christian texts spread throughout the Greek-speaking world for centuries afterward. Euclid may have written his foundational work on geometry while working in Alexandria. The mathematician Euclid, whose text on geometry would go on to shape mathematical education for well over 2,000 years, is believed to have worked in Alexandria during the city's early flourishing as a center of learning, quite possibly drawing on the resources and scholarly community the library and Mouseion provided. Archimedes is thought to have studied and corresponded with scholars connected to Alexandria. While Archimedes himself was based in Syracuse, historical accounts suggest close intellectual ties between him and scholars working in Alexandria, exchanging problems, proofs, and ideas across the Mediterranean. Alexandria functioned, in this sense, less as an isolated building and more as the hub of a much wider ancient network of mathematical correspondence. A scholar in Alexandria calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy over 2,000 years ago. Eratosthenes, who served as head librarian, used the differing angles of sunlight measured at two separate locations in Egypt to estimate the circumference of the Earth. His calculation, achieved using nothing more advanced than shadows, geometry, and careful observation, landed remarkably close to the figure accepted by modern science today. Eratosthenes also created one of the first known systematic maps of the known world. Drawing together geographical accounts collected from travelers, traders, and earlier scholars, Eratosthenes compiled a map attempting to represent the known world with lines of latitude and longitude, an early and surprisingly organized attempt at systematic geography, made possible in large part by the sheer breadth of material the library had gathered. Alexandria scholars debated whether the Earth orbited the Sun, long before it became widely accepted. An astronomer named Aristarchus, associated with the intellectual environment surrounding Alexandria, proposed a model placing the Sun rather than the Earth at the center of the universe, nearly 18 centuries before the idea gained broader acceptance in Europe. His work survived only in fragmentary references by later writers, a quiet, early flicker of an idea the world was not yet ready to adopt. A librarian at Alexandria may have measured the tilt of the Earth's axis. Working from careful astronomical observation, scholars connected to the library are credited with estimating the angle of Earth's axial tilt with notable precision for the era, a measurement that would go on to matter enormously for understanding seasons, calendars, and the movement of celestial bodies across the sky. The library likely held detailed medical texts, some based on human dissection. Alexandria became known as an unusually significant center for anatomical study in the ancient world, with physicians such as Herophilus reportedly conducting detailed examinations of the human body, including the nervous system, in ways rarely permitted elsewhere at the time. Whether human dissection was practiced as openly as some later accounts suggest remains debated, but Alexandria's medical reputation was substantial regardless. Herophilus is often credited as one of the first scholars to systematically distinguish arteries from veins. Working within Alexandria's unusually permissive medical environment, Herophilus is believed to have made detailed observations of the circulatory and nervous systems, contributing foundational anatomical knowledge that would influence medical understanding for centuries, much of it likely recorded and preserved, at least for a time, within the library's collection. The library may have contained detailed engineering treatises, including early designs resembling simple machines. Alexandria was home to inventors such as Hero, later known as Heron of Alexandria, credited with devices including an early steam power device called an eolipile, along with various mechanical inventions involving gears, pressure, and early automation. Some of this work likely existed in written form within the library's technical and scientific holdings. Some ancient accounts describe automated devices built in Alexandria, centuries before the industrial era. Descriptions attributed to Heron of Alexandria include mechanisms for automatic doors, simple vending devices dispensing liquid in exchange for a coin, and various pressure-driven contraptions, suggesting a surprisingly playful, experimental engineering culture surrounding the city's intellectual institutions, much of it documented in texts the library is believed to have preserved. The library existed for hundreds of years before its final disappearance, not for a single dramatic afternoon. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about Alexandria's library is the idea of one sudden, singular fire that destroyed everything at once. In reality, most historians describe a much slower story, one of gradual decline, repeated damage, shifting political fortunes, and multiple separate incidents spread out across several centuries, rather than one clean, cinematic ending. Julius Caesar is often blamed for a fire that damaged Alexandria's library, though the details remain uncertain. During conflict in Alexandria around 48 BCE, Caesar reportedly ordered ships in the harbor set ablaze, and the resulting fire may have spread to nearby buildings, possibly including warehouses storing scrolls close to the harbor. Ancient sources differ on how severe this damage actually was to the library's main collection, and some historians believe the losses, while real, have likely been exaggerated over time. Some ancient writers suggest the fire connected to Caesar destroyed warehouses of scrolls, rather than the library's main building. Because Alexandria's harbour area reportedly stored large quantities of scrolls awaiting shipment or copying, some historians argue the damage attributed to Caesar's conflict may have primarily affected these external storage areas, rather than obliterating the core scholarly collection housed within the Mouseion itself. The library's decline may have been driven as much by shrinking funding as by fire. As political instability increased across the Ptolemaic dynasty's final decades, and later under Roman rule, financial support for scholars, maintenance, and the ongoing acquisition of new texts likely diminished considerably. A library, even one filled with irreplaceable scrolls, requires continuous care, copying, and funding to survive, support that gradually became harder to sustain. Papyrus scrolls decay naturally over time, requiring constant copying just to survive. Unlike more durable materials, papyrus is fragile, vulnerable to humidity, insects, and simple age. Maintaining any ancient library's collection required an ongoing, labor-intensive process of recopying deteriorating scrolls onto fresh papyrus. Without steady institutional support to fund this work, even scrolls that survived any particular fire would have slowly crumbled away regardless. A later ruler is said to have expelled many of Alexandria's scholars, weakening the institution considerably. Ptolemy VIII, ruling in the 2nd century BCE, is described by some ancient sources as having driven a number of scholars out of Alexandria during a period of political purges, scattering skilled researchers to other cities around the Mediterranean and likely disrupting the steady scholarly continuity the library and Mouseion had depended on for generations. A related institution called the Serapeum may have housed a secondary collection of scrolls. Alongside the main library, a temple complex known as the Serapeum, dedicated to the god Serapis, is believed to have held an additional collection of texts, sometimes described by ancient writers as a kind of daughter library, expanding Alexandria's overall reach beyond the original Mouseion building alone. The Serapeum was destroyed in the late 4th century CE amid religious conflict. In 391 CE, under an edict targeting non-Christian temples across the Roman Empire, a mob is described as having destroyed the Serapeum in Alexandria, an event some ancient and modern historians associate with additional, serious losses to whatever remained of the city's once vast written collections by that point in time. By the time the Serapeum fell, the original library's collection had likely already diminished significantly. Centuries of political upheaval, reduced funding, natural decay, and earlier damage meant that Alexandria's legendary collection was, by many historians' estimates, already a shadow of its earlier scale well before the events of 391 CE. The destruction of the Serapeum is often described less as the single ending of the library, and more as one of several late chapters in a much longer story of gradual loss. A brilliant mathematician and philosopher named Hypatia lived and taught in Alexandria during this turbulent later period. Hypatia became one of the most respected scholars in the city, teaching mathematics and philosophy and reportedly contributing to work on conic sections and astronomical instruments. Her life, deeply tied to Alexandria's fading intellectual world, ended in violence in 415 CE, a tragic reflection of just how volatile the city's political and religious atmosphere had become. The Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE is sometimes blamed for the library's final destruction, though most modern historians consider this account unreliable. A frequently repeated later story claims that upon capturing Alexandria, orders were given to burn any remaining books, on the reasoning that they were either redundant with or contrary to existing scripture. Most contemporary historians view this particular account with significant skepticism, noting it appears in sources written centuries after the events it describes and fits patterns of politically motivated storytelling common in that era. By the time of the Muslim conquest, there is little solid evidence the original Grand Library still existed in any significant form. Because of the many earlier centuries of decline, fire damage, funding loss, and natural decay, most modern historians believe Alexandria's once legendary collection had already effectively ceased to exist as a major institution long before the 7th century, making later stories blaming a single, final, deliberate burning difficult to support with available evidence. The truth of the library's ending is less a single dramatic villain and more a long, slow erosion. Rather than one identifiable culprit or one specific date, most modern historical accounts describe Alexandria's library fading gradually across several centuries, worn down by fires, funding cuts, political instability, religious conflict, and the simple, patient decay of fragile papyrus left uncopied. It is a quieter, sadder story than the popular legend, but likely closer to what actually happened. An enormous amount of ancient literature is believed lost, regardless of exactly how or when the library declined. Historians estimate that only a small fraction of the works produced by ancient Greek and Roman writers have survived into the modern era, with countless plays, historical accounts, scientific treatises, and philosophical works known today only through brief references made by later authors. Alexandria's library, whatever its precise fate, represents one especially concentrated and symbolic example of this much larger, ongoing pattern of loss. We know entire plays existed only because ancient writers quoted brief lines from them. Of the many tragedies believed written by ancient Greek playwrights, only a small number survive in complete form today. Countless others are known solely through short-quoted fragments preserved in the writings of later scholars, tantalizing scraps hinting at entire stories, characters, and ideas that have otherwise vanished completely from history. Some lost works are known today only by their titles, listed in surviving catalogues or references. Ancient bibliographic references, including those possibly connected to Alexandria's own cataloguing efforts, occasionally preserve nothing more than a title and an author's name for a work whose actual content has been completely lost. These bare titles function almost like gravestones, marking the existence of an idea without preserving any trace of what it actually said. Historians sometimes reconstruct lost ancient texts using quotations scattered across many other surviving books. Because ancient authors frequently quoted, summarized, or referenced earlier works within their own writing, scholars can sometimes piece together partial reconstructions of otherwise lost texts by carefully gathering these scattered references from dozens of unrelated surviving sources, a slow, patient kind of literary archaeology stretched across many centuries. The loss of ancient scientific texts likely delayed certain discoveries by many centuries. Some historians argue that ideas proposed by ancient scholars, including early heliocentric models and precise astronomical measurements, might have advanced scientific understanding considerably sooner had the texts describing them been more widely preserved and circulated, rather than surviving only in fragmentary, second-hand references long after their original authors had died. Ancient copying was a slow, entirely manual process, making every lost original especially costly. Before the invention of the printing press, every additional copy of a text had to be written out entirely by hand, a slow, labor-intensive process prone to small errors accumulating with each new copy. This made large libraries like Alexandria's especially valuable, and especially vulnerable, since losing an original scroll before it had been sufficiently copied could mean losing the work forever. Alexandria's library likely employed a significant staff of scribes dedicated specifically to copying texts. Maintaining and expanding such a vast collection required continuous manual labor from trained scribes, tasked with producing fresh copies of aging scrolls, transcribing newly acquired works, and correcting errors introduced during earlier rounds of copying, an enormous, ongoing undertaking largely invisible in most popular retellings of the library story. The library is believed to have influenced the design of later great libraries throughout history. Alexandria's ambitious model, combining a vast collection with resident, state-supported scholars, is often cited as an early conceptual ancestor of later major libraries and research institutions established across the following centuries, an enduring blueprint whose basic structure still echoes, in some form, in major research libraries today. Alexandria was not the ancient world's only major library, though it became by far the most famous. Other significant libraries existed in cities such as Pergamon, in modern-day Turkey, which reportedly built its own substantial collection, occasionally described by ancient sources as a rival to Alexandria's own. Alexandria's especially large-scale and strong association with prominent scholars likely helped secure its lasting reputation above these other centers of ancient learning. A rivalry with the library at Pergamon reportedly led to an unusual restriction on papyrus exports. According to one frequently repeated ancient account, Egypt restricted the export of papyrus specifically to slow the growth of Pergamon's rival collection, indirectly encouraging the development of parchment, a durable writing material made from treated animal skin, as an alternative. Whether entirely accurate or partly legendary, the story reflects just how seriously ancient rulers apparently took library rivalry. Parchment eventually became a widely used alternative to papyrus for preserving important texts. Unlike papyrus, which required a specific reed-based plant primarily grown in Egypt, parchment could be produced wherever livestock was available, making it a more geographically flexible writing material. Its durability also made it considerably more resistant to the kind of gradual decay that steadily wore away many of Alexandria's original papyrus scrolls over the centuries. Alexandria's lighthouse, standing near the same city, became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though a separate structure from the library itself, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, known as the Pharos, rose alongside the city's harbor around the same era the library was flourishing, symbolizing the city's broader ambition and prosperity during a period when Alexandria stood among the most impressive and intellectually significant cities anywhere in the known world. Alexandria itself was deliberately designed as a grand, planned city rather than growing organically over time. Founded by Alexander the Great and later developed extensively under Ptolemaic rule, Alexandria featured wide planned streets, a carefully designed harbor, and monumental architecture, reflecting the same ambitious spirit that led its rulers to attempt gathering the world's written knowledge into a single, unprecedented collection. The library scholars did not simply store knowledge. They actively debated, corrected, and expanded upon it. Alexandria functioned as a living, working institution rather than a passive archive, with scholars regularly comparing different manuscript versions of the same ancient text, correcting errors accumulated through repeated copying, and producing what were considered authoritative editions, particularly of works by Homer, whose writings received considerable scholarly attention at Alexandria. Alexandria scholars are credited with helping establish the standard, authoritative texts of Homer's epic poems still referenced today. Because so many varying manuscript copies of Homer's works existed by the time scholars at Alexandria began their careful comparative work, their efforts to establish consistent, corrected versions had a lasting influence on how these foundational texts were transmitted and understood by every subsequent generation of readers. The library likely contained extensive works of literary criticism alongside the original texts themselves. Alexandria scholars did not merely copy and preserve literature. They also produced commentary, analysis, and critical evaluation of existing works, effectively creating an early tradition of formal literary scholarship, much of which would have existed as its own substantial body of writing stored somewhere within the library shelves. Some ancient sources suggest Alexandria's library included works on astrology alongside more rigorous astronomical observation. Reflecting the broader intellectual culture of the era, in which the boundary between astronomy and astrology was often blurred, Alexandria's collection likely held texts blending precise mathematical observation of celestial movement with more speculative interpretations of what those movements might mean, a reminder that ancient scholarship did not always draw the same firm lines modern science does today. The library is believed to have held extensive geographical and travel accounts gathered from across the ancient trade world. Because Alexandria sat at a major crossroads connecting the Mediterranean, Africa, and routes reaching toward Asia, its library likely accumulated detailed accounts from travelers and traders describing distant lands, unfamiliar customs, and geographical features far beyond what most residents of the ancient Mediterranean world would ever personally witness themselves. Alexandria's intellectual reputation attracted scholars from across the known world. Rather than serving only Egyptian or Greek residents, the city and its library drew visiting scholars, students, and thinkers from various regions surrounding the Mediterranean and beyond, creating a genuinely cosmopolitan center of learning where ideas from multiple distinct cultural traditions could meet, mix, and be recorded side by side within the same collection. Some ancient accounts describe visiting rulers being deeply impressed, or even intimidated, by the scale of Alexandria's collection. The sheer scope of the library's holdings reportedly became a symbol of Ptolemaic wealth, ambition, and cultural authority, with the collection itself functioning almost as a form of soft political power, a demonstration of prestige meant to rival, and in some way surpass, the accomplishments of other great civilizations of the era. The library's exact physical location within ancient Alexandria remains uncertain today. Because so much of ancient Alexandria has since been built over, altered, or lost to rising sea levels and shifting coastlines, archaeologists have never definitively located the precise remains of the original Mouseion or its library. Much of what we understand about the building itself comes from written descriptions rather than physical excavation, adding another quiet layer of mystery to an already elusive story. Parts of ancient Alexandria have since sunk beneath the waters of the Mediterranean. Due to a combination of earthquakes, gradual land subsidence, and rising sea levels over roughly 2,000 years, sections of the ancient city, including areas potentially near the original royal quarter, now lie submerged offshore. Underwater archaeological teams have recovered statues, architectural fragments, and other remains from these sunken sections in recent decades. Underwater excavations near Alexandria have revealed fragments of the ancient city that once surrounded the library. While no confirmed remains of the library itself have been recovered, nearby underwater archaeological sites have yielded columns, statues, and structural remnants offering glimpses into the broader royal and civic areas of ancient Alexandria, indirectly helping historians better understand the physical setting the library once occupied. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina was built in the same city as a tribute to the original library. Opened in 2002 near the site of ancient Alexandria, this modern library and cultural center was constructed explicitly to honor and echo the legacy of the ancient institution, housing millions of books and serving once again as a major center of research and learning in the same historic coastal city. The modern library's striking circular design was intended to evoke the sun rising over the Mediterranean. Architecturally, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina features a large tilted disc shape facing the sea, its granite walls inscribed with characters from numerous written languages from around the world, a deliberate symbolic gesture connecting the modern institution to the ancient library's original spirit of gathering knowledge from every corner of the known world. Historians continue to debate almost every detail of Alexandria's original library, from its size to its ending. Because so much of what we know comes from later writers describing events that occurred generations, or even centuries, before their own time, and because so few contemporary first-hand accounts survive, historians must carefully weigh which details reflect genuine historical memory and which have been exaggerated, distorted, or invented over centuries of retelling. The popular image of one single, catastrophic fire likely says more about how legends grow than about what actually happened. Dramatic single events tend to be remembered and repeated far more easily than slow, complicated institutional decline spread across several centuries. Alexandria's true story, involving multiple separate incidents, gradual funding loss, and simple decay, has understandably been compressed over time into a simpler, more memorable narrative centered on one single dramatic burning. Ancient writers themselves sometimes disagreed about which events actually damaged the library. Different historians writing in antiquity, sometimes centuries after the events they describe, offer varying and occasionally contradictory accounts of exactly when and how significant damage occurred to Alexandria's collection. This lack of clear, consistent contemporary documentation is itself part of why the library's fate remains such an enduring historical mystery today. The loss of Alexandria's library is often used as a symbol representing the fragility of accumulated human knowledge. Beyond the specific historical details, the story of Alexandria has taken on broader symbolic meaning, frequently invoked as a cautionary reminder of how easily concentrated knowledge can be lost through neglect, conflict, or simple institutional decline, regardless of how impressive or valuable that knowledge once appeared to be. Some scholars argue the deeper tragedy was not one dramatic fire, but centuries of quiet underfunding. Rather than focusing solely on any single destructive event, some historians emphasize that Alexandria's gradual decline reflects a broader, less dramatic lesson, that sustained institutional support, ongoing funding, and continuous maintenance are just as essential to preserving knowledge over time as protecting a collection from any single catastrophic threat. Alexandria's story reminds us how much surviving history depends on chance and circumstance. Which ancient texts happened to survive, and which were lost forever, often depended less on their importance and more on factors like which monasteries later chose to recopy certain works, which regions avoided major conflict, and which materials proved durable enough to physically endure across centuries, a quiet, somewhat unsettling reminder of how fragile the historical record really is. Modern digital archives are sometimes described as an attempt to avoid repeating Alexandria's fate. Large-scale digital preservation projects, aiming to scan and store vast quantities of historical texts, are occasionally framed explicitly in relation to Alexandria's story, an attempt to distribute copies of knowledge so widely and redundantly that no single fire, flood, or political upheaval could ever again threaten to erase it all at once. Even digital preservation carries its own quiet risks, echoing Alexandria's original vulnerabilities. Just as ancient papyrus required continuous copying to survive, modern digital files require ongoing maintenance, format updates, and careful stewardship to remain accessible over long periods of time. In this sense, Alexandria's fundamental lesson, that knowledge requires continuous, active care to survive, applies just as clearly to server rooms today as it once did to a warm, quiet room full of aging papyrus scrolls. Ptolemy II is believed to have significantly expanded the library's collection during his reign. Building on his father's foundation, Ptolemy II reportedly pursued an especially aggressive acquisition policy, working to gather as comprehensive a collection of Greek literature and scholarship as possible, a period historians often associate with some of the library's most significant early growth. The library likely employed a formal head librarian, a position of considerable prestige in the ancient world. Figures such as Zenodotus, Eratosthenes, and Callimachus are believed to have held this role at different points, overseeing the collection, guiding acquisition priorities, and leading the broader scholarly community associated with the Mouseion, a position that placed them at the very center of the ancient world's intellectual life. Zenodotus is credited as the library's first known head librarian. Serving in this role during the early 3rd century BCE, Zenodotus is believed to have worked extensively on organizing and editing the library's growing collection of Greek poetry, including early efforts to establish more standardized, corrected versions of Homer's works, laying groundwork that later scholars at the library would continue to build upon. Alexandria scholars debated the size and shape of the Earth using nothing but mathematics and careful observation. Long before satellites or modern instruments existed, the astronomers and mathematicians associated with the library relied entirely on geometry, shadows, and patient, careful measurement to reach conclusions about the physical nature of the world, achievements that remain genuinely impressive even when viewed through a thoroughly modern scientific lens. The library's collection likely included detailed works on ancient mechanics and physics. Alongside more famous mathematical and astronomical texts, Alexandria scholars produced writing exploring principles of leverage, pressure, and simple machines, laying early conceptual groundwork that would later influence engineering and physics for centuries, much of it surviving today only through fragments or later summaries rather than complete original texts. Some of Alexandria's mathematical achievements were essentially forgotten in parts of the world for well over 1,000 years. Certain mathematical and scientific insights developed by scholars connected to Alexandria did not become widely known or built upon again in parts of medieval Europe until many centuries later, sometimes rediscovered independently, or reintroduced through translated texts preserved and transmitted through other regions and traditions during the intervening centuries. Translated Arabic scholarship played a crucial role in preserving and eventually reintroducing many ancient Greek texts to medieval Europe. During periods when certain ancient scientific and philosophical works had become rare or entirely lost within parts of medieval Europe, scholars working within the Islamic world translated, studied, and preserved many of these texts, later reintroducing them to European scholarship through translation, a vital, often underappreciated link connecting the ancient and medieval worlds. Without careful translation and preservation efforts across multiple civilizations, considerably more of Alexandria's intellectual legacy might have vanished entirely. The survival of many ideas first recorded or developed in connection with Alexandria's library depended on a long relay of careful copying, translation, and preservation carried out across many different cultures and centuries, a fragile, cooperative chain stretching from ancient Egypt through the medieval world and eventually into the modern era. The story of Alexandria's library has inspired countless works of fiction, art, and popular imagination. Writers, filmmakers, and artists across many centuries have returned repeatedly to the image of a burning library, using it as a powerful symbol for the loss of knowledge, the fragility of civilization, or the tension between preservation and destruction, ensuring the story continues circulating widely even among audiences unfamiliar with its more complicated, less dramatic historical reality. The exact contents of the library's full collection will likely never be known with certainty. Because comprehensive original catalogues have not survived intact, and because so much of what we know comes from scattered second-hand references, historians can only partially reconstruct what Alexandria's shelves actually contained at any given point in its long, gradually fading history, leaving much of its true full scope forever unknown. Alexandria's legacy endures largely through the ideas that managed to survive elsewhere, rather than through any surviving physical building. Because the original structure itself has left no confirmed physical remains, what endures today is primarily the intellectual legacy carried forward through copied texts, later commentary, and centuries of scholarly transmission, an inheritance built not from stone or scrolls, but from ideas that managed to outlive the room that first gathered them together. Some historians consider the true tragedy of Alexandria to be less about any specific fire, and more about a broader pattern repeated throughout history. Political instability, funding neglect, and slow institutional decline have repeatedly threatened concentrated centers of knowledge throughout human history, long before and long after Alexandria. In this sense, Alexandria's story functions less as an isolated ancient tragedy and more as an early, especially vivid example of a pattern that has quietly repeated itself many times since. The library's story continues to shape how modern institutions think about preserving knowledge. References to Alexandria appear regularly in discussions surrounding library funding, archival preservation, and digital data storage, a reminder that the lessons drawn from an institution that faded away roughly 2,000 years ago still meaningfully inform decisions being made about libraries, archives, and knowledge preservation today. Ancient Alexandria's harbour once welcomed ships from across the entire Mediterranean world. As a major trade hub connecting Egypt to Greece, the Levant, and beyond, Alexandria's harbour would have seen a constant flow of goods, travellers, and, according to tradition, books, arriving from many different cultures and languages, feeding directly into the library's ambition to gather knowledge from every corner of the known world. The library likely represented one of the largest concentrations of human knowledge that had ever existed up to that point in history. Considering the sheer scale of its collection relative to what any single institution had previously gathered, Alexandria's library is often described by historians as representing an unprecedented concentration of written human knowledge for its era, a genuinely singular achievement in the history of civilization. Much of what later civilizations understood about mathematics, astronomy, and geography likely passed, at some point, through Alexandria's scholarly community. Because so many foundational ancient thinkers were directly connected to Alexandria's intellectual environment, either through residence, correspondence, or later study of texts associated with the library, its influence likely touched an enormous portion of subsequent scientific and philosophical development across the following centuries, whether or not the specific books themselves ultimately survived. The idea of gathering all of humanity's knowledge into one place remains a powerful ambition today. Modern digital archives, universal encyclopedias, and vast online repositories all echo, in some form, the same underlying ambition that first inspired Alexandria's founders more than 2,000 years ago, the belief that knowledge gathered, organized, and preserved together becomes more valuable and more powerful than knowledge scattered and left to fade quietly on its own. Alexandria's library never fully vanished from human memory, even after it physically disappeared. Despite its uncertain and gradual physical decline, the idea of the library persisted vividly across centuries of retelling, becoming, in many ways, more famous and more symbolically powerful in memory than it may have even been in its own time, a rare case of an institution's legend outliving the institution itself by well over 1,000 years. What we are left with, in the end, is not a clear final answer, but a long, quiet accumulation of partial evidence. Rather than a single tidy conclusion, the story of Alexandria's library survives today as a patchwork of ancient references, archaeological fragments, scholarly debate, and centuries of retelling, each piece adding a little more shading to a picture that will likely never be fully complete, a mystery gently unresolved, and perhaps, in its own way, more fascinating because of it. As our journey through the Library of Alexandria comes to a close, perhaps that ancient harbour city feels a little more real now, less a single dramatic legend and more a slow, patient, deeply human story. We've wandered through scrolls confiscated from passing ships, through scholars measuring the earth using nothing but shadows, through centuries of quiet underfunding, sudden fires, and gradual decay, and finally through a memory that somehow outlived the very building that first held it. Nothing burns in a single night quite as often as the old stories suggest. Most things, knowledge included, fade slowly, one uncopied scroll, one quiet budget cut, one small loss at a time. Now you can let all of that drift softly into the background. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the images fade from bright detail into something softer and more distant, like sunlight settling gently over a harbour at the end of a very long day. And if you enjoyed this journey, perhaps you might like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps other curious minds find their way here, too, one quiet century at a time. And if you happen to still be awake, there will be another slow journey waiting for you on the screen, another quiet corner of history to drift into gently. But for now, let your mind grow still, and let the day fall away. Sleep well, and good night.